What's up, everybody? I'm back here again with another review, but this time I'm looking at the top 10 tight ends for this year's fantasy season. And again, I'm going to try and keep it brief, maybe about a 15-minute video. I'm only doing top 10 because after the top 10 guys, it gets so questionable in terms of where does everyone rank? Everyone becomes so close. So I just like to keep it to top 10, but by all means, if you guys want me to do a little bit more of an in-detailed review, let me know, and I'll do just that for this video for future videos. So with all that being said, let's get it going. As you can see, my number one guy is obviously Gronk, and this is unanimous. This is maybe only the unanimous decision in all of football. And with Gronk, you've got a guy that's Brady's favorite target. You've got a guy who dominates in yards, dominates in touchdowns, but also dominates in yards after the catch. Obviously, though, his biggest question mark is his health. If you knew you were going to get 16 games of Gronk without an injury, I wouldn't be upset at where he's going, which is usually, from what I've seen, especially in 12-man PPR leagues, anywhere between the late first round to early second round. And for me, that's just personally too high for a guy that has a really big health question mark. And again, if I had to bet, and you usually kind of think about this stuff when you're drafting, I'd much rather have a guy that's a lot more reliable and taken in the first round versus a guy that I'd bet on missing at least one game in the season. But with all that said, even with those injury concerns, he's still the number one guy. That's how good Gronk is. Moving on right on to number two, I've got Travis Kelce, who I see as a mini Gronk. For me, the one thing that separates them is that you've got Brady throwing to Gronk and you've got Alex Smith throwing to Kelce. With Kelce, you see similar things as with Gronk. You see those yards after the catch. You see those targets in the red zone. Something that I personally like is the fact that with Macklin gone in Kansas City, Kelce is going to inherit some of those targets. I know Tyreek Hill probably will as well, but I would say that Alex Smith feels more comfortable with Kelce. My only question that I have with Kansas City is Alex Smith going to be the quarterback for the entire season? If he is, then I feel pretty good about Kelce having a really good year in fantasy. And as far as where he's being drafted currently and how I value him, I'd say I'm seeing him drafted around the third or fourth round, and I have him as my number two tight end. So if he lasts around that third, fourth round, I would pull the trigger immediately. And I would say the same for my number three guy, who's Greg Olsen. And personally, I could flip-flop number two and three, Greg and Kelce. I've got Olsen here just because there's a lot of new faces in Carolina. You got McCaffrey, you got Curtis Samuel. I think the Panthers are going to try and justify those picks, so they're going to try and get them targets. I know Olsen had a dip in his touchdowns last year compared to the year before, but if you're interested in stats, he's the only tight end to put up back-to-back 3,000 plus yard seasons receiving. So that's impressive as hell. And if you ask me, he's Cam Newton's favorite and both most reliable target. If Cam Newton stays healthy all 16 games, I think Olsen has a better year than he did last year, because you kind of saw his performance slip a little bit when Cam Newton got hurt. And then going on number four, I've got Jordan Reed. I know that this might not be super popular as far as where he's being ranked, because I've seen a lot of people say he's the number two tight end in fantasy, which I completely disagree with, especially if you have to use early third round pick on Jordan Reed. And the reason I say that is because with Reed, you've got those injury concerns again, and he's not nearly as good as Gronk to overshadow those injury concerns. Also, you've got Kirk Cousins, who I'm not the biggest fan of, and I know that a lot of times with Washington, I've said it before, they get a lot of their points in garbage time when they're already behind. And I don't like to rely on that. Also, um, they keep bringing in new guys, and the system's always changing in Washington. So I'm scared of that lack of consistency, and I think all those things are going to hurt Jordan Reed in the long run. At number five, though, I've got a guy who I really like to potentially break out. Not that he hasn't been a good tight end before, but I've got Martellus Bennett at number five, obviously going from the Patriots and Brady to the Packers and Rodgers. And I mean, that's not a bad deal. Having balls thrown from Brady to go into Rodgers, definitely must keep him happy. And I think it should keep fantasy owners happy too, because in terms of Green Bay, the offense runs that team, and I think Randall Cobb is falling out of favor a little bit. So I think Martellus Bennett will inherit some of those targets, and I think he's probably the biggest guy on that offense in terms of big body. So he'll be that big target possibly in the red zone for Green Bay, and I really like him to crack the top five, maybe challenge some of those guys at number four, number three. We'll see as the season goes along. At number six, 6 through 10, this is where it gets a little bit more questionable for me, just because I feel like any of these guys can jump each other. But as of right now, I've got Jimmy Graham at number six, and if you actually look at the rankings from last year of the tight ends, he was in the top five tight ends. The things that scare me with Seattle and Jimmy Graham is that I wouldn't say he's Russell Wilson's favorite target. That's probably Doug Baldwin. Um, Also, that offensive line in Seattle scares me a little bit still. I don't know what's going to happen there. But if they figure things out, Jimmy Graham could very well have a really good year. The things that I do like about Graham is that he's a big target again, red zone target. Seattle did target him in the red zone pretty heavily last year. Also, I think he's finally figuring out the system they're running in Seattle and what he has to do and what they expect of him. And it's been another year later since that rough injury that he had. So all those things play in his favor. Number seven, I've got Tyler Eifert, and again, he's another guy that has injury concerns. He missed a good chunk of last season with those back issues, but if you noticed when he came back, he was targeted heavily, especially when AJ Green was out. He was the number one guy um, in Cincinnati, and for those concerned and that are saying, "Oh, Cincinnati had a down year, Eifert didn't have those numbers," I would say one of the reasons why Cincinnati had a down year was because Eifert wasn't there, because AJ Green wasn't there. When both those guys are there, both those guys show up. Eifert's another big body guy that they like to use in the red zone. So if he can stay healthy, I like him a lot, especially for where he's going. He's going in the late rounds again, and if you can guarantee that that health with him, he'll be a steal at some point in the draft. At number eight, I've got a guy in Delanie Walker who's been very consistent and probably Marcus Mariota's favorite target since he's been drafted. The reason I have him at eight, though, is that he's kind of getting up there in age, and mainly, however, is the fact that the Titans added a lot of offensive weapons. They got the receiver in the first round this year. They've also added Eric Decker, and I think both those guys are going to take away from Delanie Walker. But if those guys struggle to catch on, then Delanie Walker will probably again have a pretty solid year and could be just outside that top five ranking. Number nine, I've got a guy that I personally do like with Kyle Rudolph, but I'm just not sold on the quarterback that's going to be throwing him the football. And I don't know if that quarterback is going to be Sam Bradford for 16 games. I think Sam Bradford prefers guys like Stephon Diggs and Thielen over there in Minnesota. So I don't exactly know what's going to happen. Sometimes they use Kyle Rudolph more for blocking as well. And he's also just a guy in general that sometimes plays really well and has those big games, but other times is pretty mediocre where he's got 3 receptions for 30 yards or something like that. But otherwise, if they had more quarterback stability in Minnesota, Kyle Rudolph would be a lot higher on my list. And finally, finishing off my top 10, I've got Jack Doyle. This is a guy that's pretty young, but that I'm pretty high on. And one of the main reasons that Dwayne Allen went from Indy to New England so that Jack Doyle now becomes the main guy for Andrew Luck. On top of that, with Andrew Luck healthy, that's immediately going to be more targets for Doyle. Uh, Indy likes to use their tight ends in the red zone, and on top of that, if you look at his stats from last year, he finished, I believe, barely outside of the top 10. But with all those things going for him, I do think he cracks the top 10, and could potentially become one of Luck's favorite targets and ascend through the ranks of these other guys just outside the top 10. But with all that being said, that wraps up my list of guys. As far as some guys that maybe you were expecting to see but just missed the list, I had Hunter Henry, I had Antonio Gates, I had Ertz, and at least for those guys in San Diego, the reason is they're both splitting time. So if there was a clear-cut guy, maybe I have him in the top 10. For Philly, I've got Ertz outside the top 10 just because they added Alshon and Torrey Smith this year in the offseason. So I think there's going to be diminished targets there. But that pretty much wraps up this video. Let me know what you guys think. Leave those comments. Give me that feedback. And I'll come back with another list, running backs, receivers, and then hopefully I'll also come back with a live mock draft in the near future here. So thanks.